to check raise or not check raise? That is the question. It's Wednesday the 26th of August, and this is something I've been looking forwards to doing. Excited about it over the last sort of few weeks, and just to build up to when I actually really start playing a lot more regularly live in September. And I think fundamentally in low stakes live poker, the use of check raising is much less frequent than it really should be. And I think in particular, the sort of strategy that I've evolved through the background coaching and training that I've had, check raising is a really, really important element of that. Particularly where, for example, you're the pre-flop raiser and you end up becoming out of position, somebody calls you behind. Having a strong check raise strategy in that situation is really, really important. And also when, defending the big blind and becoming more aggressive with that post flop. It might surprise many of you that the frequency of check raising really should be in excess of 25% of your range, ideally 30% of your range. And this is much, much higher than most players actually do in reality, because I think there's concerns around building big pots with potentially slightly lower equity hands, or you're worried about folding out villain when you've got a really strong hand, and people just generally play a little bit more passively, hoping to see better turns and rivers to give them more confidence that the hand's going to hit. So that's what I want to do. Try and keep it punchy today. Just talk through a few ideas, and then as we go into September, start to bring in more specifics around particular situations and hand classes and that sort of thing. So why do we actually want to check raise? Well, when we've actually got a good value hand, what this allows us to do is to actually build bigger pots. Bigger pots for value hands. It's that simple. So if we're in a situation where we are out of the position and we check, and then our opponent bets, if we've actually got really good hand set, or good two pair or a really good top pair, then we can put in a check raise. And I'll come on to some nuances around that in a little bit. But what about if we've actually got a potential bluff? Well, there are three main reasons why we want to be check raising in that situation. The first is, can we actually make a better hand fold? So in a simplistic way, if we've, say, defended in the big blind and we've got 6-5 suited and we've got some sort of low equity type draw, if villain c bets in position, we can check raise. We may actually get a fold from their king queen or king jack off that's actually air, but is technically a better hand than ours. The second reason when we actually have a bluff is to try to make a value bettable hand by the turn, so that the turn card actually improves the equity that we have in our hand to allow us to either bet for value or continue barreling where the equity of our hand actually improves. So say, for example, our low equity draw that we're using actually improves to a higher equity combo draw, or the gut shot that we're using as a check raise actually hits the card and we can play for stacks straight. And the third situation is where we can actually block nutted hands. So say, for example, we've got a situation where our hand is the inside of a potential straight, something like that, then check raising that can actually block the potential for our opponent to have those potential straights, and we can draw to those nutted hands. Or where, for example, on particularly dry boards, we might actually check raise with a bottom pair, say, which actually blocks the opportunity for our opponent to have good two pairs and sets and things like that. So there's some really interesting nuances, but the key message is that we should actually be looking to check raise a lot more than probably we all currently do. Okay, there are a number of nuances around check raise, and I'll just try to quickly summarize. In general terms, the wetter and more dynamic the board, the larger we can probably check raise, particularly against recreational players. Also, the bet size that the in-position player actually uses can often signal the strength of their hand. So if they bet small, we can actually check raise a lot wider. If they bet larger, potentially representing a more stronger hand, and we might actually check raise with a tighter part of our range. With check raise sizes, also, you see a lot of this sort of 3.5x the in position player's bet size. And I think generally in situations where you are playing against decent trying recreational players or regs or pros, actually check raising to that sort of size is probably the best course of action. One of the reasons being is that they themselves will probably be often c-betting range, so their range themselves is actually quite weak, but also they're more sensitive to bet sizes, and you may often actually get folds from their weaker part of their range, so the check raise actually fulfills a purpose of actually getting a better hand to fold when you check raise. However, against weaker players who may be more insensitive to bet sizes, and their inelastic hands could actually be quite wide, then this is where you could actually potentially go for much larger check raise sizes. And as you guys know, I've had a hungry horse background with looking at coaching through Mark Goon and the stable there, and on a lot of the material you see on YouTube, they really talk about these big check raise sizes, sometimes 6x, 8x, because of this insensitivity of players to check raise sizes, which then often allows you, if you're out of position, to play two street games, even with decent bluffs, to really whack it in on the turn when you've got really good high equity, and it can generate lots of folds. And even if you do get cold, your equity can actually realise. But against decent regs, that's a little bit more tricky. So trying to stick to this sort of 3 to 4x type check raise size is probably better overall value. Also, stack depth is really, really important. Players are much more sensitive when they've actually got shorter stacks. So even if you're playing against the loosest, most splashiest sort of recreational player, you've still got to be cognizant of their stack size. So if you do put in a check raise and they're very short, you may still be then looking at 3 to 4x rather than these big check raise sizes. And how do you build a check raising range on any flop type? Well, first thing to do is actually start with your value. So you'd be looking to check raise your sets, probably your 2 pair, your thick value plus hands, say top pair, decent kickers. If the player actually stabs quite small, if they stab larger, say 75% pot, something like that, or more, then really, because they're signifying that they themselves have a potentially really strong hand, you should only really be looking to check raise your can play for stacks hands and just call with your thicker value type hands. And on the turn with value, if there's a brick card, then often you can just keep on barreling, try to get that SBR down to below 1 on the river to allow you to get all the money in. But if there's a nut changing card that doesn't necessarily help you. Say a flush comes in, or there's a straightening card, or there's a ball pairing card, then that's when you might need to actually consider slowing down a bit, either checking or potentially actually just betting small. If you've got a really good hand, then if your hand improves, to keep villain in, or to see whether or not they themselves have improved, and you might need to wait and see if they're actually going to raise you off before you proceed into the river. And with bluffs on wet dynamic boards, they're often very easy to find, and this happens probably more regularly within a low stakes live poker environment, where you've got combinations of flush draws and straight draws, even combined, where it's fairly obvious that you can raise off with those drawing hands. And in those situations, you also might be wise to protect your calling range with your worse sort of flush draws to allow you to keep balanced. Generally, the value that have the bluffs that you check raising and your calling range. So it's not just middling pairs or thin value type hands. You've actually got some draws in there as well. However, when flops become drier and less connected, finding check raises becomes a lot more challenging, and this is where sort of understanding the potential for your hand to improve on the turn is really, really important. So you may be looking at hands which have good backdoor equity. So say 3 to a flush or 3 to a straight type hands on really, really dry boards. So say a board like Queen 8-3 Rainbow. Sometimes you may actually be looking for check raises where you've got King Jack, and so in essence you've got a couple of cards there that wrap around the Queen, 3 to a straight. If a King hits, it's probably a positive out for you. Even a Jack might actually give you a thin value hand, but in those situations it's really quite difficult to find those check raises and prepare to put them in. So on a flop like Queen 8-3 Rainbow, another hand that might actually be a good potential for a check raise would be something like 9-7 suited, where you've actually got a backdoor flush draw, you've got a backdoor straight draw, and the 9 sits above the 8. So if you do hit a 9, then you could actually have second pair, which might have a thin value property to it as well. And if you check raise with lower equity draws, with backdoor equity, those sorts of hands, and you do get called, generally only really proceed on turns if your hand actually improves to say an 8 out hand as a minimum, where you can actually pick up equity. If you actually hit something which gives you a pair, you may want to check that as well, or a showdown value type hand, you might want to check that as well, but only really continue with bluffs where your equity improves. Otherwise, check back, maybe see what villain does when you've checked the turn. If they bet, if they actually check back themselves, then you might get an opportunity to hit your equity on the river, and you can then take it from there. Or even if you miss, you might feel that you actually still have a bluffing opportunity, which might be quite sensible if you've got 7 high, 6 high, or whatever it might be. I'm going to leave it there. This is really just an introduction to a number of threads that I want to do moving in September, hopefully using some real live hands that I've encountered when I've been playing, and really encourage you to think about check raising opportunities. I'm really enthusiastic about them because it's a core part of what I'm trying to do. It's not always in everybody's comfort zone, but try to embrace some of the ideas, and actually you can generate some really good value from a well thought out check raising approach. I'm actually going to the Hippodrome tonight, so I'm looking forward to that, and I'll get a short up for that a bit later. I'm back on that little journey of 4 days, 4 casinos, even though it's been stretched out a little bit over a couple of weeks. Anyway, catch you later. Thank you. Bye bye.